Today, we're looking at Private Reserve's Dakota Red. Hi, I'm Adam, and I'm an ink guy. I get inks, test them, and share the results with you. Now, Private Reserve's Dakota Red, as it sounds, is a red ink. To make sure I have a range of experience with this ink, I do the writing samples. I then put the ink into a different pen for a day. I then put it into a Delike Alpha with a medium nib to take my notes for this video. Before we get to the writing samples, let's look at the sciencey bits. And up first is the chromatography, and I agree with Vita that I've learned a lot by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. I put a line of ink down and immediately dunk it in the water for 10 to 15 seconds. And we see that it starts pushing straight up the page. We see a lot of pink, we see some red stripes come in, but it basically goes down and pushes up as a very, very light red. The one on the right I let dry for 10 minutes before I dunk it in the water. But what we see is a much darker red line on the bottom, kind of that holdout position. Then that light red or pink with some darker red-ish coming in around the top is what we get. But I don't expect to see a ton of holdout for this ink. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it might be to clean out of your pens. I let the smear dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter, especially looking at that second H, it seems to be my key letter for seeing how these things do when it comes to the highlighter. What I see is that it's blooming out, and I'm worried that it would become unreadable if it was something important. This ink, to me, I would not use if I had to highlight. Not surprising when we look at what happens with water. I put a drop down for 30 seconds and then immediately dab it up, and we see a tremendous amount of that ink come up. Not all of it, but a tremendous amount of that ink. Given more than 30 seconds, it may be able to completely go away. Pen flush does very much the same as water. It reactivates and pulls a bit more of this ink up. Instead of being left with a very light red, we're being left with a kind of pink from the pen flush. So I do think there's an opportunity that maybe water's not enough to get this out of your pen and you might need flush, but I would really work that water first. Bleach, as would be expected, is completely pulling it off the page, but it did leave some of that yellow staining behind, and the bleach isn't yellow and the paper's not yellow, so that's from this ink. For the inks I've tested, I've found an average viscosity of 2.5, with the realm of normal being from 2.1 to 2.9. Private Reserve's Dakota Red has a viscosity of 1.57, which makes this a very wet ink. It's getting in on that red area. To find my average dry times, I use my writing samples done with an extra fine and medium nib on Clairefontaine, Tomoe River, and Rhodia paper. Private Reserve's Dakota Red has an average dry time. For the inks I've tested, I've found an average dry time of 17 seconds, with the realm of normal being from 13 to 21 seconds. Private Reserve's Dakota Red has an average dry time of 13 seconds, which makes it normal. It's a normal ink. While it's the faster side, it is normal. Now, let's look at the writing samples. I have this ink in sample form, and to keep my writing samples consistent, I use a Jinhao 159 with a Goulet 1.1 stub, a Jinhao X450 with a Goulet medium, and a Jinhao X750 with a Goulet extra fine. Let's look at Clairefontaine. We have no bleeding, no ghosting. The 1.1 gives us no feather, no spread, no halo, no sheen. Light shading. Light shading in red. Light shading nowhere else. The light shading. The extra fine gives us no feather, no spread, no halo, no sheen. Some shading throughout the writing. We definitely see that K is darker in quick. The B is darker in brown. The J is lighter than we turn to the U in jumps. So we get some nice shading throughout this writing. 6 seconds to dry. Medium, a darker tone of red. No feather, no spread, no halo, no sheen. The shading doesn't show up. And it looks like quick has feathering. Focus. Focus. Let's try changing this. There we go. It looks like Quick has feathering that's starting, which I don't know that I've ever seen on Clairefontaine. No spread, no halo, no sheen, no shade with the medium, 12 seconds to dry. When we look at the scrubbies, the extra fine shows us some shading. We did get some shading in the writing. The medium shows us some shading, but we're not really seeing it in the writing. And we've got that weird spot where Quick looks like it's starting to feather, but it's the only spot, so it makes me wonder if something got on the paper. But it is there, it is the result. Yeah. The smear thing makes me feel I could recover this if I did smear while I was writing. So I look at Tomoe River, it gives us no bleeding, gives us ghosting. The 1.1 has no feather, no spread, no halo, no sheen, no shade. Tomoe River to me makes ink boring. Even if it's a boring ink, this is a third red in a row. So I'm just a little less enthused. I can't help it. A little less enthused. Third red in a row. Extra fine. No feather, no spread, no halo, no sheen, no shade. 11 seconds to dry. The medium gives us a darker tone. No feather, no spread, no halo, no sheen, no shade. 31 seconds to dry. So after you write with this, go boil an egg or something. It's going to take a while. The scrubby shows us no color variation, and we didn't get any color variation. The smear said you can't recover it because you wrote this on Tomoe River. I don't know why you would be sloppy if you're going to write on this paper and smear. There's a lot written there. It's just smeared and you can't write it. I used a PO nib. Rhodia, no bleeding, no ghosting. The 1.1 gives no feather, no spread, no halo, no sheen, and no shade. Not for the 1.1. The extra fine gives us no feather, no spread, no halo, no sheen, some shading through the writing. I'm going to call it a consistent amount of shading. That's just not the biggest jump in shading, like we see in the word jumps. The M to P gets darker. The F to O gets lighter. The B to R gets lighter. C to K gets darker. So we do get the shading. It's just not so bold as what we're seeing when we get to the scrubby. 6 seconds to dry. Medium, a darker tone with no bleeding, no feather, no spread, no halo, no sheen. We do have some color variation. Again, not a lot. Because it's even wetter, it kind of goes from that darker version, or a dark version of this red, to a darker version of this red. And we more see it in a word-to-word thing, not in an individual word, but from one word to the next. Really hard to tell on camera, but lazy is just a tone darker than dog. The is a tone darker than quick. So the shading that we see is intact in a word. It doesn't occur in the word. The scrubby test shows us that we should get some color variation. We do get some color variation in the writing. I'm sorry, the medium had 13 seconds to dry. The smear test says we could likely recover this if we smeared when we were writing. So I decided to test this with some different tone papers, like the yellow Rhodia, where we got no bleeding, no ghosting. And let's look at the tone difference. It's lighter and nicer. It is a nicer tone of red. Why didn't you tell me I was way off center? You're watching this. Tell me next time. Jeez, people. It's a lighter tone throughout all of the writing with the yellow than it is with the white. Makes it a nicer color. The 1.1 has no feather, no spread, no halo, no sheen, and no shade. 5 seconds to dry. Really? Oh, even faster. Dried faster on the yellow. The medium gives us no feather, no spread, no halo, no sheen, no shade. 12 seconds to dry. Again, the shading that kind of occurs is more of a word-to-word thing. I'm seeing right now little spots in the extra fine that are kind of darker. So this is not really your shading ink. That's, you have to hunt for it. 12 seconds to dry with the medium. Scrubby shows us more color variation than we actually see in it for the extra fine. The medium shows us almost none, and we see almost none. So I'm not really talking about this as a shady ink. But I don't see a lot of reds that are very shady. The smear test, you can trust red. It's not shady. The smear test says we could likely recover this, like the white paper, if you did smear it. So I tested Word Notebook. We get bleeding, not bleeding that touches the next page, but definitely bleeding all the way through, all of the writing. With the medium, we have spread, we have feather. The feather's tiny. It's tiny all over, gives it that blurry look. But I think if you were walking around and you wrote big using an extra fine, you could jot your notes down on a Word notebook using this ink. I would go to the extra fine and I would write big. It has no halo, no sheen, and no shade. The extra fine gives us gives us spread, gives us feathering. Again, that light feathering all over it, all the way around everything. Light feathering gives it that blurry kind of look. No halo, no sheen, and no shade. 1 second to dry, which is the redeeming factor. The smear says we're not getting any color variation. We didn't. The scrubby says it. The smear says you're not going to smear this ink. Barely any of it moved, and I do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 smear. So there's a redeeming factor for it. I don't think with the extra fine you're going to hit the page underneath, so if you're not worried about using the back side of the paper, this wouldn't be too bad. So I decided to test this on 28-pound copy paper. Now the medium gives us some bleeding, the extra fine not. The extra fine doesn't really even give us ghosting. The medium at the top gives us spread, gives us feathering. No halo, no sheen, and no shade. That feathering is that same light feathering all the way around everything that makes it a little blurry. The extra fine gives us some spread. It moves up to about a fine. It gives us some feathering all over again. It's just really tiny feathering all over. No halo, no sheen, no shade. 1 second to dry. Scrubby says we don't get any color variation, and we didn't. Smear test says if you're using this on this paper, you're definitely able to recover if you smear. So probably not too bad for a lefty. That's all I have in the writing sample. Instead of finding inks that look like Private Reserve's Dakota Red, I would prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. And I've chosen Krishna's Christmas Eve because it is a beautiful, bright blue. Before I give my opinion on this ink, I would ask, if you've enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up. And if it's your first time here, I would invite you to subscribe. So what do I think of Private Reserve's Dakota Red? Now this is my opinion on a lot of reds. Like many reds, I find this one boring. Not bad, just boring. And not boring in the really good, I like it way. Boring, it's very predictable, which is good, but boring, it's uninteresting to me. Thanks for watching.